Genial. Bueno, muchísimas. Ahí me avisó que está grabando.
Yeah,
bueno, muchísimas gracias nuevamente a todos por la invitación.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah,
Switch
let
to
me,
English.
yes,
Sorry.
let me give you a brief introduction. So we are delighted to have Mariana Zerpa from Leuven in Belgium. So we have 1 hour, questions in between. We are really delighted to have you, and feel free to, ask questions or stop at some point if you want to me read the chat or anything like that. Okay.
Thanks a lot, Carlos. Thank you very much. And thank you everyone for being here and inviting me, even though it's online. It's a pleasure to be with you. Please interrupt me as many times as you want. And Carlos, yeah, I would be thankful because I don't see the chat right here. So if you can let me know if anyone writes, but otherwise just anyone can interrupt me, and that's probably easier. So I'm going to present this paper. It's called Dynamic Incentives in Retirement Earnings Replacement Benefits, and it's joint work with Andrés Dean and Sebastián Fleitas. For some reason, it's not, okay. Now let me switch. So the motivation for this paper is that in most countries, we still have as the main social security system, or at least the main pillar of the social security system, defined benefit pensions, which means that pension benefits are calculated as a replacement rate multiplied by some measure of average pre-retirement earnings. And in this kind of setting, a key question is how these pre-retirement earnings are computed. In most developed countries, they have shifted towards computing it based on the whole lifetime of earnings, so just averaging across the whole history of reported earnings to the Social Security Administration. But in many countries, and especially in Latin America, it's very common to have only a smaller set of years. And this is probably due to limited information. So when you don't have great information systems, it's easier to look at a shorter period of time. So it's very common to look at the last, let's say, between 5 and 15 years of reported earnings to calculate benefits. And this can be good for the workers in the sense that the last years of earnings could be better earnings than the early years, but it does create this dynamic incentive where you have an incentive to report higher earnings in the years that matter for benefit calculation. And this is particularly relevant if you have weak enforcement of earnings reporting, right? So if you have a lot of informality or a lot of misreporting of earnings, then it's much easier for workers, especially self-employed workers, to report more earnings in the years that matter for the benefit calculation. And this imposes higher costs on the social security system, but also it creates some fairness problems between people who exploit these incentives and those who don't. So what we want to do here is try to understand these incentives and how workers respond to them. Of course, to respond, it's not just the benefit, the existence of the benefit calculation that matters, but also this enforcement issue, right? And so we highlight that self-employed workers, and there's now a large literature that shows that self-employed workers tend to respond more to the incentives of the tax system, tax and benefit systems, because they can more easily change reported earnings, either because they don't have a third party who is also reporting their benefits, and also because they're harder to monitor. Now, for employees, this can be more difficult, but in small firms, we know, and in developing countries, this is more common, that small firms also have a lot of informality and a lot of underreporting of earnings, and also the closer relationships that a small firm can allow can also mean that potentially small firm workers could also respond to this type of incentives. So let me tell you in a nutshell what the paper does, and then we'll get into the details. So what we do is we use Social Security records from the Social Security Administration of Uruguay, together with also household surveys. And in Uruguay in particular, I'll get into the details later, but the summary is that mostly pension benefits are calculated based on the last 10 years of reported earnings. And the minimum retirement age is age 60. And so what we do is we look at the expected start of the benefit calculation window relative to that minimum retirement age. And we look at reported earnings before and after age 50. And so we, in our event studies, we control very, what's key here is to control very flexible for time effects, which can be correlated with age, and other controls that all the controls potentially we can control for. So the key assumption is that there are no other reasons for changing your reported earnings before or after the start of this benefit calculation window. And we look separately at self-employed workers and employees by firm size, and we distinguish between very small firms of less than 10 workers and larger firms. So we do other stuff, but let me tell you what are the key takeaways. So we find that self-employed workers report higher earnings after age 50. On average, we find an increase in about 3% of reported earnings, and the earnings are flat leading to age 50. So it's not like this is an undergoing trend. And we find the same or very similar results, a bit more noisy for small firm employees. And as a counterfactual of sorts, the large firm employees who are much less likely to be misreporting earnings don't have any response. So we don't see any change in their behavior. And so this is with the Social Security records. Then we go to household surveys and we say, okay, is this actual changes in reported in true earnings? Is it labor supply, or is it just a change in reporting? And so in the household surveys, we replicate the same analysis with reported earnings in household surveys where there's no incentive to change reported earnings at age 50. And indeed, we find no changes either in hours of work or in earnings as reported to the household surveys. So this suggests that the changes in reported earnings are explained by a change in reporting. And finally, what we do is we do some back of the envelope calculations of what cost this implies to the Social Security Administration. And we calculate that this increases the net expenditures in pensions for these groups for the self-employed workers by about 2%. We focus on self-employed workers because these are the stronger results, but this is a lower bound. If we added small firm employees, obviously this would increase. Okay, any questions so far? All right, so let me tell you how this fits into the literature. There's actually not a lot of previous literature, at least not empirical literature on this. So there is a small set of papers that focus on teachers, so occupational public pension schemes in the US. So Maria Fitzpatrick has this paper where she shows that teachers tend to earn more in the last 3 years of their work life, which is when what matters for the benefit calculation in that setting. But there's no previous evidence that we know of a large scale private sector pension system and how workers respond to these incentives, despite this being present in many, many countries. This also fits into a larger literature on tax evasion and income sources, right? So there's Saez and co-authors have a few papers that show that self-employed workers tend to respond more to tax incentives and find larger responses to, for example, the earned income tax credit or kinks in the tax schedule. And there's also a paper by Kumbler and co-authors looking at Mexico and showing that third-party reporting matters for the reporting of income for the income tax. All right, so I will show you some just descriptives to motivate the analysis. So this is the retirement age distribution. So I'll get into the data later, but this is just to show you that there's a very sharp increase in retirement at exactly age 60. We in the administrative data, we actually have like the different types of retirement, and the retirement that happens before age 60 is usually due to disability. So this motivates the use of then age 50 as this break in when workers should start responding. Even though workers, switch this. So even though workers might retire later, this age 50 could serve as a sort of a framework for when to start to change their behavior if you're uncertain about exact age of retirement. So this is just the raw data without any control. So this is just average reported earnings for each of the 3 groups of workers. And I'm looking at 2005 and later to avoid the big recession in Uruguay in the early 2000s. But you can see here that earnings for large firm employees, which is a blue line here, are relatively flat. They sort of have already a downward slope after age 45. If I showed you the full age distribution, you would see them increasing up to around age 45, and then they start this slightly decreasing trend. And then for employees of smaller firms, which is the green line here, and the self-employed, who are the yellow line, you can see how after age 50, they start increasing reported earnings. Now, this could be many things because this is not controlling for anything. This could be just time effects correlated with age or cohort or whatever. So we will need to be a bit more sophisticated on this, but this is just to motivate the raw data that we see this divergence in the reported earnings of these groups. So the rest of the talk, if I have time to cover everything, I will give you a conceptual framework, so it's just a very simple model to think about these incentives and how workers respond. Then we'll talk about the background and institutional details, the data and the results. And then I'll also show you, if there's time, the back of the envelope calculations. So the model, this is a very simple model, 3-period single agent. So here we're thinking about self-employed workers. Of course, this could be extended for employees as well, but then you would have to add some bargaining between employees and employers. So in the periods 1 and 2, this is a working period. So workers work and pay contributions over reported earnings to the Social Security. And then in period 3, they retire and their pension income is based on the reported earnings in period 2. So this is a simplification of the setting. It's not exactly like this in real life, but the idea is that period 1 doesn't matter for the calculation of benefits. There's no borrowing or savings except through the pension system. And here we're assuming that earnings are like pre-tax earnings are exogenous. You could make this endogenous and try to see how they could also respond from the labor supply point of view to try to change actual earnings. The motivation for looking only at assuming exogenous earnings is that we don't actually see responses on the labor supply side. So what do the individuals choose? They choose how much to report to the Social Security Administration. Let's call that W. And they report that every period. Period 1 and period 2, and then they contribute a tax rate multiplied by those reported earnings. And there's a minimum contribution base in each period, which is also the case for self-employed in Uruguay. We assume that contributing less than the true earnings has a cost. We're agnostic about what this could be. This could be actual penalties, or it could be just a psychological cost or effort cost from misreporting earnings. And then the pension benefits, as I said, are a weekly increasing function of reported earnings in period 2. It's very common in most pension systems to have a minimum level of benefits. That means that the earnings, the pension benefits are flat in some part of that function. So the workers maximize present value of utility of the 3 periods. Where we assume that consumption, so basically consumption in period 1 is true earnings minus what they pay in taxes, minus that penalty for, or that cost from misreporting earnings, which is a function of true unreported earnings. And the same goes for period 2. And then in period 3, the income and the consumption is just the income from pensions. So, and in this setting, then what is the optimal reported income in each period? In period 1, it's really simple. So there's no reason to report any earnings except for that penalty, right? That cost of misreporting. So workers will set reported earnings such that the marginal cost of contributing, which is a tax, equals the marginal benefit of the decreased cost of misreporting. And so here even, so it doesn't depend on the pension system, but there are some sources of heterogeneity that's good to take into account. So depending on the level of earnings, some people will be reporting the minimum contribution base, others will be reporting more, and then can also be heterogeneity based on the cost of misreporting. In the second period, this is where the, yeah, there's a question?
Yes, so about the distribution of income, so what is the assumption of how this income is distributed? And I mean, first there will be truthful income, the real income distribution, and then there will be the declared
Reported
income distribution, right?
Yes, yeah. So we don't impose any functional form, but of course, what the functional form that you, or at least the partial derivatives that you, the sign of the derivatives that you impose will affect who will report more or less. So it's very typical to assume that this penalty is increasing in true earnings and decreasing in reported earnings. So it could be just a function of the difference between the two. If you think that the authorities, if this is a penalty, for example, a psychological cost, then it could just be a function of the difference between the two. But if you think there's, for example, it depends on the enforcement, it's a monetary penalty from enforcement, then you could think that people with higher earnings will have a higher expected penalty, and this penalty increases with that mismatch between the reported and the true earnings. So larger firms will be more exposed to the monitoring and therefore will have larger penalties. So we expect that under reasonable assumptions, these incentives to report truthfully, or at least not underreport so much, are stronger for higher income individuals.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks. So the second period, it's very similar. So, but now we have this second.
Sorry, I have a question.
Yeah.
Sorry, from the last slide.
Yeah.
So in the first period, so if you report more, shouldn't you have more income at the end? In the third period?
In the third, so we are assuming that the first period is a period that you are reporting earnings, but it's not taken into account for the calculation of the pension benefits. So okay. Let me just, like in Uruguay, for example, the last 10 years are counted. So this would be the years before those last 10 years.
Okay.
That's period one, yeah. And so that's exactly the difference between period one and period two. In period two, it's that benefit calculation window where what you report matters for your pensions. And so we add this term. So the first two terms, the cost, the marginal cost of contributing is the same as before. There's a marginal benefit from this cost of misreporting, but there's an additional marginal benefit, of course, discounted by the discount factor for the expected increase in consumption in period three, sorry, because the more you report in period two, the more pension benefits you will have in period three. And so that's this third term here. So what does this mean? This means that for at least some workers, it will be optimal to increase reported earnings in period two. There's, of course, the same sources of heterogeneity as before with true income and the cost of misreporting, but now you also have some heterogeneity from the marginal increase in expected pensions. For example, people with very low earnings might always be below the minimum contribution, the minimum pension, and so they might not have such incentive to increase reported benefits, reported earnings. And of course, now the discount factor also comes up at play. So the closer you are, this here we are assuming it's just one, period two is just one period, but if you think of this as a multi-period period, then it might become more relevant the closer you are to retirement. Yes, Raimundo, you have a question.
Yes, I imagine that while people are taking decisions, there may be some public agents that are discussing potential reforms to the pension system. So I wonder whether you're incorporating or not any expectation component within this 3-period model.
Expectations about reforms in the
how those reforms potentially change, for example, the age of retirement or things like that, like whether those potential changes actually change your actual decision of consumption and reporting of incomes or not.
That's a great question. So we didn't consider that. So we're assuming in the model, at least we're assuming people know when they will retire, and so they know when the period starts. But if you have uncertainty on retirement age, then of course, because you have multiple years within that period too, you would have probably, it would be better to increase reported earnings closer to retirement, even if you have to increase more the reported earnings. So if you don't have credit constraints, then you could do that. If you have credit constraints, then you might just want to increase them evenly across years. But the fact that there could be uncertainty about retirement age could be an incentive to delay the responses a little bit. So yeah, we should discuss this again when we look at the results, because in fact, we do see some delay, especially for self-employed in the responses. Yeah, Ronald, you have a question? Oh, yeah, I think you're muted.
Sorry, I have just a clarification question. In period 2, the guys are going to over-report income. So the question is it going to be a penalty for over-reporting, or there's no penalty for over-reporting?
Right, yeah, so we assume there's no penalty. We assume nobody over-reports. Well, that's actually a result, right? Because you have, for over-reporting, you would have to be reporting truthfully in year 1, and then increase, and then over-reporting period 2. Yeah, we just assume that away. So we assume that the only changes are are by increasing. So let me think. So I think, yeah, actually in the model there's no constraint on that, because the constraints are that you that your earnings, your reported earnings, so your taxes plus the penalty cannot exceed your income, but that's all there is. So potentially it could be that they over-report. In our data, actually, self-employed workers substantially under-report earnings, and so even after responding to these incentives, they're still, on average, substantially under-reporting earnings. But it's possible in the model. At least it's definitely possible to over-report as well. Yeah. Okay, so the other thing that the last thing that I wanted to mention about this is that there's sort of 2 margins of response. There's the extensive margin of going from reporting the minimum to reporting more than the minimum. So that's sort of one group of workers who were potentially inframarginal in period 1, but after part of those workers could become start reporting above minimum contribution base. And then there's the people who always report above the minimum contribution base, who are probably higher income, who will definitely have an incentive to report more if they are underreporting in period 1. Okay, so those are the key takeaways from the model, and that's what we're going to try to show that this happens in the data. So I don't need to give you a lot of background about Uruguay. It's one of the few audiences where I can say this, but just to give you some background, Uruguay, of course, it's very similar to Chile in many aspects. And in terms of informality, during the period that we can see there, which is between the mid-90s until until 2016, informality rate was going down. So from around 40%, including self-employed, to around a quarter of workers. So it's moderate informality. It's lower than most Latin American countries. The retirement system, it's defined. So before there was a reform in 1996, I won't get into a lot of details because it's not super important for our paper, but before the reform, it was purely a defined benefit system where you contribute, you pay your taxes, and then the benefits when you retire are calculated over a certain, this average of your pre-retirement earnings multiplied by a replacement rate. The 1996 reform introduced a two-pillar system where you have a basic pillar that is, again, like before, the purely defined benefit. And then there's also savings account pillar where part of the contributions go to a savings account that then gives some annuity in the future. But in both cases, before and after the reform, people are still receiving most of their pensions from the defined benefit pillar. And that pillar, basically, the way the benefits are calculated is a replacement rate times a measure of pre-retirement earnings, which is based, it's either the reported earnings on average in the last 10 years of work or the best 20. So they take the maximum of these two. But if you have gaps in reporting in your employment history, or you have increasing earnings over time, they tend to be the last 10 years of work. The minimum retirement age is 60 years old with 30 years of contribution to the Social Security. And then the benefits are, the replacement rate increases if you delay retirement up to age 65. And the average retirement age, well, I already showed you the plot of the histogram, but the average retirement age is 63. So the main data set that we use is a sample of Social Security records. These are the full data set has records for about 300,000 workers who were active for at least 1 month between the years 1986 and 2016. We construct a sample of this that fits our empirical strategy. So we look at men, because men are, first, they're more likely to retire near retirement age because they have fewer gaps in their reporting. And also their minimum retirement age was 60 throughout the period. It didn't change. So we limit the sample to workers who we observe for at least 6 months reporting formal earnings when they are age 49. And we construct the sample around this age 50 cutoff, right? So we look at workers between ages 45 and 57, and then we select cohorts that are going to be in our data for the whole that age period, so that we don't have a lot of selection across age into cohorts, because we are not going to be able to simultaneously control for cohort age and time, and so we want the sample to be balanced across cohorts. And then we take the workers from the main Social Security scheme, which is Industria and Comercio. These are workers from basically all the private sector except agriculture and construction, which have their own contribution system. So we take those away. So in the data, we have the full form unemployment history. When I say full history, it's within those years. So of course, years before 1986 are the data system did not exist. We also use 3 more sources of data. So one is another similar data set from the Social Security Administration, but this is a sample of retired workers, because in our main sample, we don't observe retirement. So we got a separate data set of retired workers with their, it is a smaller sample, but it has the histories for workers who retire. And so there we can observe the distribution of retirement age. And also I'll show you some analysis that we do with actual retirement age. We also use the household surveys for the same period. Household surveys, of course, are not panel data, they are cross-sectional, but we construct similar samples. We try to mimic as much as possible the sample of the Social Security Administration. And then finally, I won't get into this, there's no time, but we also have a sample of firms where we can look at firm behavior around the time when a worker turns 50. So this is just basic descriptive statistics. I think that the most important thing to look at here is reported earnings in the Social Security data and in the household surveys. So we were able to measure earnings very similarly in the household surveys and in the Social Security data, accounting for taxes and everything. So the average reported earnings for employees is very similar for the Social Security data and household surveys. You can see here the underreporting of the self-employed. So the self-employed have similar average earnings in the household surveys as the employees, but much lower self-employment reported earnings to Social Security. And this is just on average about 30% above the minimum contribution base. So this is very low reported earnings. And then we can also see some underreporting for workers of small firms of less than 10 employees. If you compare household surveys to Social Security data, we can also see an important gap in reported earnings. And for some years, we actually have in the household survey a question about whether they're contributing for their full salary for employees, and the employees of small firms are more likely to report that they are contributing for less than their full salary. And this is of course probably a lower bound, but otherwise the two samples look quite similar. And so our main empirical strategy, I already told you, it's very simple idea. We are looking at non-parametric event studies around the start of the benefit calculation window. So we have dummies for each year before and after the start of the benefit calculation window. We have very flexible time control, so month per year fixed effects. And then we also control for other observables in the Social Security Administration data, which are firm size and sector. And we also interact those with time in the specifications that I will show you here. We run these regressions separately for the three groups that I mentioned: self-employed and employees by size firms. And then we compare to household surveys to see whether there's changes in total earnings or hours of work. So any questions so far? You're doing well? Okay. So these are the main results. So here are the event studies for the Social Security reported earnings. The first plot is self-employed workers. The outcome here is normalized to 1 for the age 49, which is a -1 here. So 0 is the age 50. And so you can see here how after age 50, slowly it starts, there's an increase in reported earnings that sort of stabilizes by age 57, it's about 3 percentage points above the age 49 earnings. And it's also very flat before that, which is consistent with that raw data that we saw. For small firm employees, it's a lot more noisy, but we see something similar in terms of magnitude. Similar evolution. And for large firm employees, we actually don't see that increase in reported earnings in the benefit calculation window. So,
question?
Yeah.
So for the large firm, who reported, the worker or the firm?
Yeah, so both for small and large firms, the employer is the one that reports earnings to the Social Security Administration. And it's very common in smaller firms to report less than the true earnings. So what we think is that there can be some negotiation, some bargaining between employers and workers in the small firms going on that allows them to increase reported earnings in that benefit calculation window. But yeah, it's reported by the employer. So what do we see in the household survey? So in the household surveys, we don't see for self-employed any significant changes. These are relatively large confidence intervals, but there's no evidence like that point estimates point towards. Yeah.
But who pays the fine in case?
That's a great question. That's a great question. It's actually the employer. So the employer is taking a risk by misreporting earnings. And this can also be another reason why large employers won't misreport, right? Because if the worker leaves the firm, or if the worker wants at any time, if they know that their earnings are misreported, they can tell this to the Social Security Administration, and there's no fault on the worker side. So it's only the employer who will pay basically they will pay some penalties and also the missed contributions, the missed taxes. So yeah, so it's but despite this, we see a lot of underreporting among small firms. Large firms, of course, the more workers you have, the more difficult it is to keep control of this. In the case of self-employed, there's no third party, and there's actually they report on a schedule, so they choose how much they report, and they can change, and they have to update this information periodically.
I see.
So in the household survey data, we don't see any changes in earnings for any of the groups. This is of course a bit more noisy, but there's no upward trend in any of these plots. And also if we look at hours of work, which are more precisely reported, if anything, there's a slight decrease over time, but there's no evidence of increases in hours of work either. This is all conditional on being a formal worker, because we want this to be comparable to the people who are reporting in the Social Security Administration. So conditional on working and being registered in Social Security, there's no evidence of increases in hours of work or in earnings for any of the groups. So if we put all these together, we can think of this as sort of a diff and diff and diff, right? So we have self-employed and small firm employees compared to large firm employees. That could be sort of a diff and diff. We actually have a robustness check where we actually we estimate it as a differences. And then you also have the reported earnings in Social Security versus household surveys. So another dimension where you can differentiate. So you can see that the only evidence of increases in reported earnings are especially for self-employed, but also for somewhat for small firm employees in reported earnings. We actually have results where I will tell you, if I have time, some about some heterogeneity where we do find for some small firm employees more statistically significant effects. So another question that you might have is, well, these effects are really slow after age 50. It's not like immediately after age 50, they increase reported earnings. And of course, there's no reason why they should immediately change. It's not like it matters exactly what you report at age 50. What matters is the average of the last 10 years. But we could think, well, what is explaining this slow response here? And of course, one of the explanations could be, well, not everybody retires at age 60, or they don't expect to retire at age 60. So this might be explained, at least in part, by the retirement age variation. So what we did to look at this is we estimate events. So we use that second sample that I told you about, the retirement sample. And in that sample, we estimate an ordered logit model of retirement age. So basically based on observables in the reported data, in the reported Social Security data, we try to predict retirement age, and then apply that model to, in our main sample, predict the retirement age of each of the workers in our sample. With that, we recenter the event studies instead of on age 50 on the predicted retirement age. And we also do some reweighting based on the predictions of the model of the predicted probability of retirement in each year. So not just recentering, but also reweighting based on expected probabilities of retirement. So yeah, Ronald, you have a question?
You're mute.
It's mute. Yeah.
Why don't self-employed workers just raise their salaries to a huge amount? Is there a limit, or is there some? That is why my question of the F function shape was.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because let me one anecdote. Sure. I remember when I was a kid, there was anecdotal evidence that in Chile, the last 3 years, I think, of salary were used to do exactly the same thing when I was a kid a long time ago, and people actually, the companies would put them in places where they would get paid more, just so they would get a better, especially state-owned companies, of course, to get a better ending pension. So, but yeah. Is there a limit?
Yeah, that's a great question. So yes, there is a limit for. So remember how I told you there was a reform and it doesn't matter too much? Well, actually, we do some heterogeneity analysis with the people affected by the pension reform, because the people in the cohorts that are in the new regime don't have a limit for reporting, but the people who are in the old regime, the fully defined benefit regime, they did have a limit on reported earnings. So they actually had a limit both on the amount that they can report. There's a scale and there's a minimum and a maximum. And there's also a limit to how often they can adjust their earnings. So they can only adjust every 3 years. And so we do a heterogeneity analysis based on these regulations, and we find quite larger responses for those that don't have that limit. Of course, the fact that it's a 10-year period means that you don't have such a such a sharp incentive as if it's like the last year and then you want to report as much as possible. This is 10 years, so it's more costly because you're also paying taxes based on these reported earnings, right? And so there's this trade-off between the increased taxes and the increased future pensions. But of course, the shorter the benefit calculation window, the more clear the incentive to report more. And we find that these regulations that limit reported earnings actually do limit the responses. Yeah, great question. Okay, so let me tell you what the results look like when we recenter on the predicted benefit calculation window. So the predicted start. So we find more clear, so this, it's very, very similar results, but we do find a bit more rapid responses among the self-employed and also the small firm employees. These are controlling for individual fixed effects to control for the potential selection into retirement, different retirement age. But so it's a bit more imprecise, but we still find similar effects and more clearly responsive at the beginning of the benefit calculation window. And again, for large firm employees, there's no clear evidence of responses either. Okay, so this is the heterogeneity that I was talking about. So there's a few things we do. And here I'm grouping, so we have different specifications, and some of these specifications just group age groups between, so these are the pre-49 years, 49 is the omitted group, then we have 50 to 53 and 54 to 57. So these are sort of the same estimates that we had in the plots, but now they're in groups of years for making the exposition easier. So first we have the full sample. This is a self-employed. So the blue dot is a full sample. The red rombo, how do you say this? Diamond is people who before age 50 are reporting above the minimum contribution base. It's not super high, but we do see slightly larger estimates for this group. And when we look at the probability of reporting the minimum contribution base, it goes down. It's a small percentage, but it goes down after age 50. So both of these margins are responding, the margins that we discussed when we were seeing the model. Then we have the frequent reporter. So of course, in Uruguay, as in many countries with high informality, self-employed people do not have very continuous reporting histories, so they have a lot of gaps. And so what we do is we look at people who have more than average density of contribution. So within that period of 45 to 57, people who report at least 70% of the time. And those are the frequent reporters. Those are more likely to be able to retire from the Social Security system, for the contributive system, and they have probably higher reported earnings as well. And so we do see slightly larger, I mean, these are not significant differences by any means, but we do see larger point estimates for this group of frequent reporters. And then this is the last thing, what I was telling Ronald about, the two pillar cohorts. So these are the cohorts exposed, so where they have less regulations regarding reported earnings, and they have, again, this is more imprecise because it's half of the sample, but the point estimates are much larger than for the full sample. So there's suggestive evidence that these regulations do have an effect on the responses. Then we have also some heterogeneity among small firm employees. This is even more clear. So for the full sample, this is the blue dot. This is the same result that I showed you before. When we look at frequently employed, so again, more than 70% of the time reporting formal earnings, these are quite larger point estimates for the small firm employees. And then if we condition on staying in the same firm, this is of course much smaller samples, but we do find also larger effects. And we also looked at the probability of changing employer, and we don't see responses on that margin. So it's not like workers are changing employer to increase reported earnings. It's actually more likely that they will be able to increase reported earnings if they stay with the same firm, which is consistent with this bargaining idea that small firms can bargain over reported earnings, and longer term relationships might facilitate this. Then we also have an analysis with a match with the firm data set, but I won't get into that because it's already late. We do a lot of robustness checks. We include different controls, include fixed effects, do a difference in differences analysis using large firm employees as a control. We look, as I said just before, at job changes and reported hours of work in the Social Security data, and find only small increases in reported hours for small firm employees. Self-employed workers, they all report full-time work, right? There's no obligation to report exactly how many hours you work. So there's no action on reported hours. For employees, it's also true that these are salary workers. So there's no obligation to report very precisely the hours of work. They have to be precise on the earnings and the monthly earnings, and not so much on the hours of work. So, but in any case, we check industries with more variation in hours of work, and we check with the employees that have more stable employment relationships, and still we don't find much action on reported hours. So most of it is coming from the implied earnings per hour. Another sort of robustness check that we do, that I mentioned before, that we have this firm level data set, is we look at what happens at the firm level when one of the workers of the firm turns 50. And indeed, we see the increase in the payroll. So we do see this is consistent with our worker data. But the increase in the payroll is completely explained by the worker who turns 50. There's no change in other workers' earnings or in the employment at the firm level. So it's not like the firm is growing or the firm is doing better, and that explains that might be correlated with worker age for some reason, and that explains the changes in reported earnings. That's not the case. Okay, so I think we have about 10 minutes. So I'm happy because I can tell you about the back of the envelope. So how much does it imply for the social? I mean, there's different ways you could look at this from a welfare perspective. We're not trying to do a full welfare analysis of this. Of course, there's winners, who are the people who are taking advantage of these incentives, and there's losers, and the clear loser here is the cost to the pension system. So what we do here is try to get a back of the envelope magnitude of these costs. So we're only going to look at self-employed. So of course, this is going to be a lower bound if we trust that small firm employees are also responding to some extent. And to do this back of the envelope calculation of the costs implied by these responses, we need to know what these people would report in the absence of these incentives, right? And we don't actually observe that. What we observe is how much they increase the earnings before and after the start of the benefit calculation window. So we do different scenarios about counterfactual earnings without responses. So first, we assume in the first scenario that reported earnings in all periods would be those reported in period one. So when I say period one, is like right before the start of the benefit calculation window. So in our empirical analysis, it would be between ages 45 and 49. We can assume that people would still be reporting the same after they start the benefit calculation window if they didn't respond to these incentives. That's a first counterfactual scenario. In that case, all the response is coming from over-reporting in period two relative to what they would ideally report in period one. This doesn't mean necessarily that they are over-reporting relative to the true earnings, but to what they would like to report in absence of these incentives. And so the cost to the Social Security Administration in this case then comes from increased spending in pensions. I can see that my internet maybe is a bit slow. Can you still?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, good. So all the cost is coming from increased spending in the pensions from the Social Security Administration, but it's partially mitigated because people are over-reporting in period two relative to what they would have otherwise done. And so that reduces the cost a little bit. The second counterfactual is assuming that they would actually always report what they report in period two. So that these behavioral responses to the benefit calculation window are all coming from under-reporting in period one. Okay, so if that's the case, then the cost to Social Security comes from the lost revenues during that period one, during those years that people are reporting less. And finally, we can think something in between, right? So we can think that the ideal reported earnings in absence of these incentives would be between those two levels of earnings. So we just assume it's the average. And then there's a mix of all these costs, right? So there would be, in absence of responses, they would report more in period 1, less in period 2, but there would also be less spending in period 3. So how do we put numbers to these costs? So we do this based on our model. So we simplify things a little bit. We assume these 3 periods, and then we we assume a discounting rate, and then we apply the statutory replacement rate and the statutory tax, the contribution tax. And then what that increasing cost, for example, let me show you in the counterfactual one. The reported earnings would be, the change in reported earnings comes from over-reporting in period 2. And so the cost comes from overspending in pensions and loss of revenues. And so those two magnitudes can be calculated based on lambda. Here is the increase, the percentage increase in reported earnings between period 1 and period 2. And then this is the average earnings in period 2. And then this is the number of self-employed people. So we can calculate this cost based on calculating the expenditures based on what the reported earnings difference is times the replacement rate, obviously discounted by the 3 periods. So we're assuming we're taking this to the moment when the worker is making the decision. And then, we are calculating this at the moment when they are about to retire. So we are discounting the past is periods 1 and 2, and the future is period 3. And then the revenue, the loss of revenue comes from the taxes that they didn't pay over that difference in earnings. So similarly for the contractual 2, it's all loss of revenues. And so it's a loss of revenues from the underreporting in period 1. And then in the scenario 3 is a mix of the two. So it's the two things combined, and the difference in reported earnings in each period is half of what they were in the previous 2 counterfactuals. So that's a general idea. So we do this with different parameters, but here let me show you our main parameterization. So we have 3 columns here for the 3 scenarios. The parameters are the same. So we assume people retire at the average retirement age of 63 with 33 years of contributions. And then this is the replacement rate, 54% for that information. And then we assume that workers contribute 23 years in the period 1 and 10 years in period 2, which is the benefit calculation window. And then based on life expectancy, they can expect 20 years of pensions. And then we have the payroll tax rate. We assume a 2% discount rate. We have looked at imposing 0 or 0.04. The results are quite robust. Of course, if you impose a higher discount rate, the effects are larger. The change in reported earnings comes from our estimation. So we estimated for self-employed up 2.8 increase relative to period 1 in reported earnings. So lambda would be 0.028. So this lambda over 1 minus lambda is 0.027. And so this is, we calculate the cost in three ways. So first, we calculate it as a percentage of the spending in self-employed pensions. This is very nice because it doesn't depend. So here, you don't need these wages and you don't need the number of self-employed. You only need this parameter and these parameters that we're assuming about the benefits, about the pension system. So it only depends on our estimates. And so this is what I told you before, that goes between 1.9 and 2.4, depending on the assumptions about counterfactual earnings. Then we calculated in millions of US dollars, accounting for the average reported earnings in our sample. And then we calculated as a percentage of the GDP, and it's about 0.1% of the GDP. There was a question, sorry, Ronald, that you wanted to ask?
But I just answered myself. I looked at the computer.
Okay.
It was
okay.
The life expectancy at 60, I thought might be higher than, because the life expectancy in Uruguay is probably about 80, no? And normally
yes,
when you calculate life expectancy at a certain age, let's say 60, you have more than the average because some people die very early. So,
Yes.
but apparently it's 19.42, so it's fine.
Yeah, no, and also we adjust for that. So in the appendix, we also have counterfactuals where we assume the retirement age is 60 or 65, and then we adjust the expectancy, life expectancy accordingly. Because if you're already 65, then of course you have fewer years of expected life. But also, given that you lived until 65, it's not linear change, right? So there's some difference there. Yeah.
Sorry, maybe you mentioned already and I didn't get it, but who over-reports more? The rich people, people with high salaries, or people? Right. Because I would say that people earning near to the minimum salary cannot over-report too much because they need the money. They don't want to pay more, while rich people don't care too much. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so we don't actually. So the only thing that we can say is, so we don't observe in the Social Security data the actual earnings, right? We only observe reported earnings, and so we cannot really say this precisely because of course our results for the household surveys, these are different samples, so we are never able to contrast for the same person the two types of earnings. But what I can tell you is that so small firms are more likely to have relatively lower earnings, okay? But of course, there's other reasons why small firms are more responsive. So, and among self-employed, people who are above the minimum contribution base in reported earnings increase their reporting a bit more. But I cannot say much about the actual earnings. What I can tell you in terms of, like, if you're trying to think of like welfare implications, these are relatively less privileged people, the ones that are responding. So they have less stable employment than the large firm employees, and they have relatively lower earnings, although the self-employed don't necessarily have low earnings. So there's a lot of heterogeneity among the self-employed. But they do have very low contributions, and therefore they will have very low pensions. So even with these responses, they have very low reported earnings, and so they will have very low pensions. So there's a trade-off there in terms of welfare. Like, do you want to penalize this and make it make the whole earnings history count? Perhaps yes, in terms of fairness, but also you have to look for ways to get self-employed to report more to the Social Security Administration. Maybe enforcing monitoring would be, or contrasting information with other sources of data or third party could be another way to do that. So just to summarize, and your question also led me to like the final comments. We find robust evidence of changes in reporting earnings consistent with the incentives present in the retirement system. Particularly self-employed workers increase reported earnings about 3% in the 10-year benefit calculation window on average. The responses are larger for workers with more stable self-employment, and the same goes for small firm employees. There's more clear evidence for small firm employees with stable employment. And there's no response of large firm workers, which is reassuring because we don't expect a lot of underreporting going on in larger firms. And the comparison with the household survey suggests that these changes are changes in reporting rather than true earnings or labor supply. So our back of the envelope calculation give a rough magnitude of around 0.1% of the GDP just from the self-employed changes in reported earnings. But you could think that these could be larger. I mean, considering that Uruguay has a 10-year period for the calculation of benefits, some countries have even shorter periods. So you could think that the incentives are even stronger if the period is shorter, and also potentially in context with weaker monitoring. So just to close, I mean, the back of the envelope is, of course, not an assessment of welfare, and the discussion that we were just having points to that, right? There are utility gains for these workers that have to be weighed against this cost to the Social Security Administration and to the taxpayer, and there are also issues of fairness. So
And another thing that could be present that we don't evaluate is that there could be potential correlation in reporting of earnings to the Social Security and other taxes. For example, firms that are small firms up to a certain level of revenue can have a different monitoring, can report taxes more in a simpler way, and they're less likely to be monitored. And so these firms are the ones that are more likely to have less than 10 employees. And this can also reinforce this incentive to underreport the earnings of those workers. So there are potentially spillover effects between different taxes. So thanks. Any other questions or comments?
Let me see. Okay. Well, thanks, Mariana. Just in time. Congratulations for that. And yeah, thanks for a very interesting paper. And yeah, we stay in touch. Thanks everybody for coming, and hope to see you next semester.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you for the great questions, and hope to see you around soon, hopefully in Chile.
Bye-bye, Mariana. Yep.
Bye. Sure.